The courthouse doors swung open, and I watched my son walk out with his head down, followed by the murmurs of family members who'd finally seen through his act. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I stood there clutching my journal, the one filled with years of documented sacrifices he'd tried to erase. 3 months earlier, I never could have imagined this moment. 3 months earlier, I was still making his favorite pancakes every Sunday morning, still believing that if I just loved him a little harder, everything would somehow fix itself. Let me take you back to when this all started, back when I thought I had everything figured out. My name doesn't matter much to this story, but what happened to me might save someone else from walking the same path I did. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, in one of those neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone, where you can't go to the grocery store without running into at least 3 people you know. My house sits on a quiet street lined with palm trees, the kind of place where you'd expect to spend your golden years in peace. I had that peace once, or at least I thought I did. The house itself is modest but comfortable. A 3-bedroom ranch style with a backyard that backs up to a wash. I'd lived here for 28 years, raised my son within these walls, celebrated birthdays and holidays here, cried through my divorce here. Every corner held a memory, every room told a story. The living room still had the scuff mark on the wall from when he'd learned to ride his bike indoors, despite my protests. The kitchen counter bore a slight burn from the time we'd tried to make caramel together when he was 12. These weren't just walls and floors to me. They were a living chronicle of motherhood. My son moved back home 2 years ago. He'd lost his job in Chicago and needed a place to land while he got back on his feet. What mother says no to that? I cleared out my craft room, the one I'd spent years making into my own little sanctuary, and turned it into a bedroom for him. I told myself it was temporary, that he'd be gone in a few months. But temporary has a funny way of stretching into forever when you keep making excuses. That craft room had been my refuge. I'd set it up after the divorce, a space that was entirely mine, where I could escape into projects and creativity. I'd organized it meticulously, shelves lined with yarn and fabric, a cutting table positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon light, inspiration boards covered with patterns and color swatches. Dismantling it felt like giving away a piece of myself, but I convinced myself it was worth it. He needed me. What kind of mother would I be if I prioritized my hobbies over my son's well-being? I remember the day he moved in, pulling up in a U-Haul truck with barely enough belongings to fill the back. His whole life in Chicago, reduced to a few boxes and some furniture. He looked defeated, shoulders slumped, eyes avoiding mine. My heart broke for him. I helped him carry everything inside, made his favorite dinner, assured him that everything would work out. I genuinely believed I was doing the right thing. The morning it all fell apart started like any other Tuesday. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee, scrolling through recipes on my tablet, planning what to make for dinner. He came downstairs around 11, which was early for him those days. His hair was uncombed, and he had that look on his face that I'd learned to recognize over the past year, the one that meant he wanted something. But this time was different. This time, he was carrying a manila folder. The folder itself was pristine, professional-looking, like something you'd present in a business meeting. That should have been my first clue that this was calculated, not spontaneous. But I was still in mother mode, still approaching every interaction with him from a place of love and concern rather than self-protection. He sat down across from me without a word, opened the folder, and slid out several sheets of paper. The header read in bold letters, 64 reasons you failed me. 1 for each year of my life. I remember my hands started shaking before I even picked up the first page. The metallic taste of shock filled my mouth as I scanned the list. Number 12. You made me feel guilty for wanting independence. Number 27. You prioritized your own comfort over my emotional needs. Number 41. You never believed in my dreams. Each item felt like a punch to the gut, but what made it worse was the clinical way he'd written them, like he was submitting a performance review to human resources. There were no examples, no context, just accusations lined up like soldiers ready to tear down everything I thought I'd built as a mother. When I looked up at him, my vision blurry with tears. He wasn't even looking at me. He was checking his phone. That image is burned into my memory. My world was crumbling, my identity as a mother being systematically demolished, and he was scrolling through social media like this was just another mundane task to check off his list. The disconnect between my emotional devastation and his casual indifference should have told me everything I needed to know. But grief has a way of clouding judgment, and I was drowning in grief for the relationship I thought we had. That should have been my first real clue that something was deeply wrong. But I didn't see it then. All I could think about was where I'd gone wrong, how I'd failed him so completely that he felt the need to document it in such excruciating detail. The paranoia started that afternoon. I found myself replaying memories from his childhood, trying to identify the moments where I'd apparently destroyed him. Did I hug him too much? Not enough? Was I too strict or too lenient? The questions spiraled in my head like a tornado, pulling me deeper into a darkness I couldn't escape. I spent hours that first day going through photo albums, as if the pictures could tell me where I'd gone wrong. There he was at his 5th birthday party, smiling at the camera with frosting on his nose. There he was at his middle school graduation, awkward and gangly in a suit that was slightly too big. There he was at prom with his date, looking confident and happy. Where in these moments had I failed him? What was I supposed to see that I'd missed? You know what's funny about love? It doesn't just make you blind. It paralyzes you. It keeps you frozen in place while the world crumbles around you. And you convince yourself that if you just stand still long enough, if you just stay quiet enough, everything will somehow right itself. That's where I was, paralyzed by the belief that more effort would finally fix everything. Because that's what mothers do, right? We fix things. We make everything better with enough love and patience and sacrifice. I started doing more for him after that list. I know how insane that sounds now, but at the time, it made perfect sense in my twisted logic. I woke up earlier to make him breakfast before he even got out of bed. I did his laundry, even though he was a grown man, perfectly capable of operating a washing machine. I paid his car insurance that month when he said he was short on cash. I covered his cell phone bill. I slipped him $200 here, $300 there, telling myself it was just until he got back on his feet. The breakfast routine became my penance. I'd set my alarm for 6:30, a full hour and a half before he typically woke, so I could prepare eggs exactly how he liked them. Scrambled, but still slightly wet, with cheese melted through. Toast cut diagonally, not straight across. Orange juice, not apple. Coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of cream. I'd arrange it all on a tray, set it on the table, and then retreat to my room so he could eat in peace. Most mornings, he'd come down, eat silently while looking at his phone, and leave the dishes on the table for me to clean up later. He never said, "Thank you." I told myself he was still adjusting, still healing from whatever trauma I'd apparently inflicted on him. My sister called one evening about a month after the list incident. We were sitting on my back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. She'd noticed I'd lost weight, that I looked tired all the time. When I told her about the list, about all the things I was doing to try to make up for my apparent failures, she put her wine glass down and stared at me like I'd grown a second head. The conversation started casually enough. We'd been talking about her youngest daughter's college applications, about the weather, about neighborhood gossip. But my sister has always been able to read me better than anyone. She noticed the way my hands shook slightly when I picked up my glass. She saw the dark circles under my eyes that I'd tried to conceal with makeup. She heard the exhaustion in my voice even when I was trying to sound upbeat. She asked me a question that still echoes in my mind. When does sacrifice stop being love and start being self-destruction? I didn't have an answer for her then. I brushed it off, changed the subject, talked about the weather or some new restaurant opening downtown. But the question lingered, hanging in the air like smoke long after she'd left. That night, lying in bed unable to sleep, I kept turning her question over in my mind. When does sacrifice become self-destruction? I'd always believed that mothers were supposed to sacrifice for their children, that it was noble and right, and what separated good mothers from bad ones. But was there a line? And if so, had I crossed it? The thing about sacrificing your money for someone is that it never feels like enough. There's always one more bill to pay, one more emergency to solve, one more crisis that only you can fix with your checkbook. I'd been helping him with rent payments before he moved back in. Then it was his student loans. Then his credit card debt from when he was unemployed. The numbers added up so slowly that I didn't notice the pattern until I was in too deep. I remember sitting at my desk one Saturday morning, going through my bank statements from the past 2 years. The total I'd given him came to just over $47,000. $47,000. I stared at that number for what felt like hours. That was money I'd saved from my nursing career. Money I'd put aside for retirement, for emergencies, for the life I thought I'd have in my later years. And it was just gone, evaporated into a black hole of his needs and wants that never seemed to fill up. I did the math in my head, converting that abstract number into tangible things I could have done with it. That was 2 years of comfortable retirement travel. That was a new roof on the house, which I'd been putting off. That was security, independence, options. Instead, it had disappeared into his various crises with nothing to show for it. He wasn't in a better place financially. He wasn't more stable or independent. If anything, he seemed to need more as time went on, not less. But here's what really got me. I'd been so focused on the money, on the tangible sacrifices I could count and measure, that I missed the other things I'd given up. I stopped going to my book club because he needed someone to talk to on Tuesday nights. I canceled my yoga classes because I felt guilty spending money on myself when he was struggling. I turned down invitations from friends because what if he needed me while I was out? I had shrunk my entire world down to the size of my house, and I'd done it willingly, convinced that this was what good mothers did. The book club had been meeting for 12 years. We'd read everything from literary fiction to trashy romance novels, from memoirs to science fiction. It wasn't really about the books, though. It was about the community, the laughter, the wine and cheese and conversations that meandered from plot analysis to life philosophy. Those women had supported me through my divorce, celebrated with me when my son graduated college, listened to me worry about aging parents. They were my tribe, and I'd ghosted them, stopped showing up without explanation. Let those relationships wither because I was too ashamed to admit what was happening in my own home. My friend Margaret, who I've known since our kids were in elementary school together, stopped by one afternoon with groceries. She'd noticed I wasn't at the supermarket as often as I used to be. When I explained that I'd been ordering delivery to save time, she gave me this look that said she knew I was lying. The truth was, I was embarrassed to run into people I knew, afraid they'd see through me and realize what a failure I was as a mother. How do you explain to your friends that your own son needed to write a 64-item list to catalog all your shortcomings? Margaret didn't push, didn't demand explanations I wasn't ready to give. She just unpacked the groceries, made us both tea, and sat with me in comfortable silence. Before she left, she hugged me tight and whispered in my ear, "I'm here when you're ready to talk." I almost broke down right then, almost told her everything. But pride kept my mouth shut. Pride and shame and the belief that I could fix this on my own if I just tried hard enough. That's when the isolation really set in. I started making excuses not to see people. I'd ignore phone calls, let them go to voicemail. I'd decline invitations with vague explanations about not feeling well or being too busy. The walls of my house started to feel less like protection and more like a prison. But at least inside those walls, I didn't have to face the judgment I was sure everyone had for me. The isolation was gradual enough that I didn't recognize it as abnormal. One canceled plan led to another. One ignored call became a pattern. Before I knew it, weeks would go by without meaningful contact with anyone outside my house. My world had narrowed to the point where my son's moods dictated my entire existence. If he was having a good day, I felt permission to relax slightly. If he was irritable or distant, I'd spend hours analyzing what I'd done wrong, how I could fix it. He started bringing his girlfriend around about 6 weeks after the list. She was nice enough on the surface, all smiles and polite conversation, but I noticed the way she'd look around my house like she was taking inventory. They'd sit in my living room, and I'd hear them talking in low voices, laughing at jokes I wasn't part of. One time, I walked by his room and heard them talking about me, The girlfriend said something about how I seemed controlling, how it must be hard for him to live under my roof with all my rules. What rules? I wanted to scream. The man came and went as he pleased, ate my food, used my utilities, and I'd never said a word about any of it. The girlfriend's name was Jessica, and she had this way of smiling at me that never quite reached her eyes. She'd compliment my cooking, but leave most of her food on the plate. She'd thank me for my hospitality while simultaneously making it clear she found my home lacking in some fundamental way. I'd catch her taking photos sometimes, quick snapshots when she thought I wasn't looking. At the time, I assumed she was just documenting their relationship. Later, I'd wonder if she was gathering evidence for some other purpose. But I stayed quiet. I always stayed quiet. Because I believed that if I just gave it more time, if I just showed him through my actions that I loved him unconditionally, he'd eventually see the truth. He'd realize that the list was wrong, that I hadn't failed him, that everything I'd done had been out of love. God, I was such a fool. The breaking point should have come sooner. Looking back now, I can see 100 different moments where I should have drawn a line, should have said enough. But it didn't happen until that Tuesday afternoon in late September when I found his phone in the kitchen. He'd left it charging by the coffee maker while he was in the shower. I wasn't the type of mother who snooped through her kid's phone. I'd always believed in privacy, in trust. But when that notification popped up on the screen, I couldn't help but see it. It was a text from his friend Marcus, someone I'd known since he was in high school. The preview on the lock screen read, "Dude, your mom still buying the whole thing?" My stomach dropped. I knew I shouldn't look further. I knew it was wrong. But my hands picked up that phone like they had a mind of their own, and I typed in his passcode. He'd never changed it from his birthday, which I'd always found touching until that moment when I realized it meant nothing about trust and everything about carelessness. My fingers trembled as I unlocked the screen. Part of me still hoped I'd misunderstood, that the text was about something else entirely, that I was being paranoid. But hope is a fragile thing, and it shattered completely when I opened the full conversation. The conversation was worse than I could have imagined. Marcus had written, "She really thinks she's the problem?" My son had responded, "Hook, line, and sinker." The list was genius. Now she feels so guilty she won't say no to anything. I had to read it 3 times before my brain would accept what I was seeing. There was more. So much more. Marcus asked if the inheritance money had come through yet. My son said not yet, but he was working on it, that I'd already agreed to help him with a down payment on a house when the time came. What inheritance? What down payment? We'd never had that conversation. I kept reading, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. He detailed every manipulation, every carefully crafted guilt trip, every time he'd made me feel small so he could build himself up. The list wasn't a genuine expression of hurt. It was a tool, a weapon he designed specifically to break me down so he could use me up. There were other messages too, conversations with different friends, all following the same theme. In one thread, he bragged about how he'd convinced me to pay for his car repairs by telling me he needed the car for job interviews, then used the money to upgrade his gaming setup. In another, he joked about how easy it was to get money out of me, how all he had to do was mention one of the items from the list, and I'd practically throw my wallet at him. They laughed about it, these grown men, laughing about how they were exploiting their mothers and girlfriends and anyone who cared about them. The shower turned off upstairs. I had maybe 3 minutes before he'd come looking for his phone. I did something I'd never done before in my life. I took screenshots. My fingers flew across the screen, capturing every damning message, every cruel joke at my expense, every confession of his calculated cruelty. Then I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it, went to my room, and sent the screenshots to my email. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might be having a heart attack. My vision kept blurring, whether from tears or panic I couldn't tell. I sat on my bed, phone clutched in my hands, staring at the email confirmation that the screenshots had been sent. Evidence. I had evidence now that this wasn't in my head, that I wasn't being oversensitive or paranoid. He had systematically manipulated me, and he'd been stupid enough to document it. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the photos on my nightstand. There was one of him at his high school graduation, gap-toothed smile and messy hair, looking at the camera like the world was full of possibilities. There was another from his college acceptance, arms thrown around me in celebration. When had that boy disappeared? Or had he ever really existed at all? Maybe I'd been so busy seeing what I wanted to see that I'd missed who he actually was. The photo from his college acceptance showed us both beaming, my arm around his shoulders, his acceptance letter visible in his hand. I remembered that day so clearly. We'd been waiting by the mailbox, both of us nervous. When the thick envelope arrived, we'd screamed and danced around the living room like lunatics. I'd been so proud, so certain that all my sacrifices had been worth it, that I'd successfully launched him into adulthood. What a joke that seemed now. I picked up each photo, examining them more closely than I had in years. There was his 8th grade science fair project, where he'd won 2nd place, and I'd taken the day off work to attend. There was the camping trip we'd taken to Sedona when he was 14, both of us covered in dust and grinning at the camera. There was his first day of kindergarten, clutching a Batman lunchbox and looking so small and vulnerable. Each image felt like evidence in a trial I was conducting in my own head. Who was guilty here? Had I failed to see warning signs all along, or had he changed somewhere along the way? I thought about the countless parent-teacher conferences where teachers had praised his charm but mentioned he sometimes played students against each other. The high school girlfriend who'd broken up with him and then refused to tell me why, just said it was complicated. The college roommate who'd requested a room change sophomore year. Were these red flags I'd ignored, or was I retrofitting a narrative to make sense of my current pain? That night, I did something symbolic that felt both small and enormous. I didn't make breakfast the next morning. I'd been making him eggs and toast every single day for months, setting them on the table before he even woke up. Like some kind of short-order cook in a diner that never closed. But that morning, I made coffee for myself, sat at the table with the newspaper, and when he came downstairs at his usual time, there was nothing waiting for him. He stood in the kitchen doorway, looking confused. He asked if I was feeling okay, if something was wrong. The concern in his voice might have fooled me 24 hours earlier, but now I heard it for what it was. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about the disruption to his routine, to the smooth operation of the machine he'd built where I was the engine that kept everything running. I told him I was fine, that he was welcome to make his own breakfast. The look that crossed his face was priceless. It was like I'd suggested he build a spaceship from scratch. He mumbled something about being late and grabbed a granola bar before heading out. It was such a small act of rebellion, but it felt like planting a flag on conquered territory, reclaiming an inch of ground that belonged to me. The kitchen felt different that morning. The silence where there would normally be the sounds of me cooking, the empty space at the table where his plate would have been, the simple act of prioritizing my own morning routine over his expectations. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I kept expecting him to come back, to demand an explanation, to make me feel guilty for this tiny act of self-preservation. But he didn't. He just left, and I sat there with my coffee and newspaper, feeling like a stranger in my own life. Over the next few days, I started paying attention to my own behavior in a way I never had before. I noticed how I'd rearrange my schedule around his needs without him even asking. How I'd tiptoe around the house when he was sleeping, even though it was 2 p.m. How I'd apologize for things that weren't my fault, weren't even problems, just to keep the peace. I was living like a guest in my own home, and I'd been doing it for so long that it felt normal. I started making a mental list of all the small ways I'd shrunk myself to accommodate him. I'd stopped watching my favorite shows because he didn't like them. I'd stopped cooking the meals I enjoyed because he preferred other things. I'd rearranged the furniture in the living room to his liking, moved my favorite chair to the garage because he said it didn't match his aesthetic. My aesthetic, in my house, that I'd owned for nearly 3 decades. One afternoon, I decided to reclaim that chair. It was a ridiculous thing to fixate on, I know. Just a piece of furniture. But it represented something bigger. It was an overstuffed reading chair in a deep burgundy fabric, the kind you sink into with a good book and a cup of tea. I'd bought it years ago at an estate sale, fallen in love with it immediately. It had been my spot, my sanctuary, and I'd exiled it to the garage without protest because he'd wrinkled his nose at it. I went out to the garage, navigated past boxes of his things that he'd never unpacked, and found my chair covered in dust and cobwebs. I cleaned it off, enlisted my neighbor to help me carry it back inside, and placed it right back in its original corner of the living room. When he came home that evening and saw it, he stopped in his tracks. He asked what that ugly chair was doing back in the house. I told him it was my chair, in my house, and it was staying. The look on his face was somewhere between shocked and angry, but I held my ground. It was just a chair, but it wasn't just a chair. I started keeping a journal. Nothing fancy, just a plain spiral notebook I picked up at the drugstore. Every time he said something that made me feel small, I wrote it down. Every time he asked for money, I documented it. Every time he manipulated a situation to make himself look like the victim and me look like the villain, I recorded it. The act of writing it down made it real in a way that just thinking about it never did. I couldn't dismiss it or minimize it or convince myself I was overreacting when it was there in black and white. The journal became my anchor to reality. When he'd tell me I was remembering things wrong, I could flip back through the pages and see my contemporaneous notes. When I'd start to doubt myself, wondering if maybe I was being too harsh, too unforgiving, I'd read through the documented pattern of behavior and remember why I'd started this process in the first place. One entry from that first week still makes my blood boil. He'd asked me for $500 to fix his car, said it was urgent, that he couldn't get to job interviews without it. I gave him the money, of course. The next day, I saw a charge on the credit card I'd added him to for emergencies. He'd bought a new gaming system, $549. When I asked him about it, he got defensive, said it was none of my business how he spent his money, that I was being controlling and invasive. His money, the audacity of it. But I didn't confront him. Not yet. I was still gathering evidence, still building my case, though I didn't fully understand why or for what purpose. It just felt important to have proof, to have something concrete I could point to when people inevitably asked why I'd turned my back on my own son. Because I knew it was coming to that. I could feel it in my bones, the way you can feel a storm building on the horizon even before the first clouds appear. My friend Clara became an unexpected ally during this time, though she didn't know it. She'd been through her own family drama years ago with her daughter, and one afternoon over coffee at her kitchen table, she told me something that changed my perspective. She said that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst behaviors. That by constantly rescuing them from consequences, you're actually preventing them from growing up, from learning, from becoming who they're meant to be. Clara's daughter had struggled with addiction in her 20s, and Clara had spent years trying to fix it, paying for rehab programs and legal fees and rent, bailing her out of every consequence until she finally realized she was making things worse, not better. When she stopped, when she drew hard boundaries and stuck to them, her daughter hit rock bottom. And that rock bottom, as painful as it was to witness, became the foundation for real recovery. Clara's daughter was 5 years sober now, rebuilding her life, and she told her mother that the best thing Clara ever did for her was to stop enabling. I thought about that a lot in the days that followed. All this time, I'd thought I was helping him by smoothing over every rough patch, by making sure he never had to struggle or suffer or face the natural consequences of his choices. But what if I'd been doing the opposite? What if I'd been stunting his growth, keeping him trapped in this perpetual adolescence where he never had to take responsibility for anything because Mom would always be there to clean up the mess? The real turning point came about 3 weeks after I'd found those text messages. We were having dinner, something I'd insisted on because I was trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, trying to figure out my next move. He was telling me about this business idea he had, how he just needed some seed money to get it off the ground. He had that gleam in his eye, that excitement that used to make me want to support whatever dream he was chasing. But this time, all I could hear was the cash register sound, the cha-ching of another withdrawal from the bank of Mom. The business idea was vague, something about drop shipping and social media marketing. He threw around buzzwords like passive income and scalable model. But when I asked for specifics, his answers were evasive. Who were his target customers? What made his approach different from the thousands of other people trying the same thing? How would he handle fulfillment and customer service? He waved off my questions, said I wouldn't understand the technical aspects, that I needed to trust him. Trust him. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was sitting across from a man who'd systematically manipulated me, who'd joked about it with his friends, who'd created an entire document designed to make me feel like a failure so he could exploit my guilt. And he wanted me to trust him with $20,000 based on nothing but vague promises and buzzwords. I asked him how much he needed. He said $20,000, said it casual as anything, like he was asking to borrow $20 for gas. When I didn't immediately respond, he launched into his pitch. He'd done research, he said. He had a business plan. This was a sure thing. And then he played his trump card. He said that if I really loved him, if I really believed in him, I'd support this venture. After all, hadn't I failed him in so many other ways? Wasn't this my chance to finally do something right? There it was, the list, weaponized again. Used as a tool to pry open my wallet one more time, and something inside me just snapped. Not in a loud, dramatic way. More like a rubber band that's been stretched too far for too long, finally reaching its breaking point. I put down my fork and looked at him, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years, and I said no. The word hung in the air between us like a foreign object, something neither of us quite knew how to process. He laughed at first, like I must be joking. When he realized I wasn't, his expression changed. The mask slipped just for a second, and I saw something ugly underneath, something calculating and cold. Then he rearranged his features back into hurt confusion, the wounded son dealing with his unreasonable mother. In that brief moment when the mask slipped, I saw him clearly for the first time. His eyes went hard, his jaw clenched, and there was this flash of pure rage that he quickly covered with a veneer of hurt. But I'd seen it. That moment of honest emotion told me more than all his carefully crafted performances ever had. He wasn't sad or disappointed. He was angry that I'd deviated from the script, that I'd stopped playing my assigned role in his scheme. He asked me why I was being like this, what he'd done to deserve such treatment. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost fell for it. Almost apologized and backtracked and opened my checkbook like always. But I held firm. I told him I needed time to think about it, that $20,000 was a lot of money. He left the table without finishing his dinner, went up to his room, and slammed the door like a teenager. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to be the perfect mother, trying to make up for a marriage that had ended badly, for a childhood I thought had been too strict or not strict enough, or somehow fundamentally damaged. I'd been so busy trying to fix the past that I'd let the present slip away from me entirely. Around 3 a.m, I got up and went to my computer. I started researching elder abuse. I know that sounds dramatic, and at first, I didn't think it applied to me. Elder abuse was something that happened to other people, to the vulnerable and helpless. But as I read through the warning signs, I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. Financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, isolation from friends and family, gaslighting, making the victim feel responsible for the abuse. Check, 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 check. The websites I found were eye-opening. They described patterns I recognized intimately, tactics I'd been experiencing but couldn't name. There were forums where other people shared their stories, and I saw myself reflected in their experiences. One woman described how her son had isolated her from friends, made her feel guilty for any activity that didn't involve him, slowly drained her savings while convincing her she was a terrible mother who owed him. It could have been my story, word for word. I read about the cycle of abuse in family relationships, how it often starts small, with reasonable requests that gradually escalate, how abusers use love and family obligation as weapons, how they isolate their victims to maintain control, how they create confusion and self-doubt so victims question their own reality. I'd been living this textbook case and hadn't recognized it because I was too close to see the pattern. There was an article about something called DARVO. It stands for Deny, Attack, Reverse Victim and Offender. It's a manipulation tactic where the abuser denies the abuse, attacks the person calling it out, and then claims to be the real victim. I thought about the list, about how my son had preemptively positioned himself as the victim of my failed mothering. It was DARVO before I'd even realized there was abuse to call out. He'd gotten ahead of the narrative, made me the villain in a story I didn't even know I was part of. I stayed up until dawn, reading article after article, feeling my worldview shift with each new piece of information. The shame I'd felt started transforming into something else. Not quite anger yet, but a cold clarity that cut through years of fog. This wasn't my fault. I hadn't failed as a mother. I'd been systematically manipulated by someone who knew exactly which buttons to push because he'd had a lifetime to learn them. I found a statistic that made me stop breathing for a moment. Over 5 million seniors in America are abused every year. 5 million. And most of them don't even recognize it as abuse because it's coming from someone they love, someone they trust. I thought about my sister's question about when sacrifice becomes self-destruction. I thought about the list with its 64 accusations. I thought about $47,000 gone and nothing to show for it but a son who resented me for not giving more. The next morning, I called my bank. I removed him from my credit card. I changed my PIN numbers. I made an appointment with a lawyer to discuss my will and make sure everything was airtight, that there were no loopholes he could exploit. With each action, I felt a little bit stronger, a little bit more like myself. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The bank representative asked if there was a problem, if someone had compromised my account. I almost said no, almost made up some excuse about simplifying my finances. But something made me tell the truth. I explained that I needed to protect myself from financial exploitation by a family member. The representative didn't ask questions, didn't judge. She just efficiently helped me secure my accounts, and when we finished, she said something I'll never forget. "You're doing the right thing. Sometimes the people we love the most are the ones we need to protect ourselves from." He noticed the changes within days. The credit card got declined when he tried to use it. He came to me, angry and confused, demanding to know what was going on. I told him calmly that I'd decided to simplify my finances, that I needed to be more careful about my spending given my age and fixed income. He didn't buy it. He knew something had shifted, but he couldn't quite figure out what. Then came the guilt trips. He started bringing up memories from his childhood, asking me if I remembered this trip or that holiday, how happy we'd been. He'd get tears in his eyes talking about how much he missed the relationship we used to have, how he felt like he was losing me. It was masterfully done, I'll give him that. But I'd done my homework now. I recognized the manipulation for what it was. I stayed firm. He'd bring up specific memories, carefully chosen to maximize emotional impact. Remember when we went to the Grand Canyon when I was 10? Remember how we stayed up all night talking when I was going through my breakup in college? Remember how you told me I could always count on you? Each memory was a weapon, designed to trigger my guilt, to remind me of the mother I'd tried to be and make me doubt my current choices. My sister came over for lunch one Saturday, and I told her everything. I showed her the screenshots, the journal entries, the bank statements. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked me what I was going to do about it. That's when I realized I didn't actually have a plan beyond protecting myself financially. I hadn't thought about what came next, about how to actually address the situation. We talked through different scenarios. I could confront him privately, give him a chance to explain or apologize. I could ask him to move out without confrontation. I could involve the rest of the family. Each option had pros and cons, each felt both necessary and impossible. But one thing became clear as we talked. This couldn't continue. I couldn't keep living in this toxic dynamic, hoping things would magically improve. Something had to change, and that something had to be me. I decided to wait for the right moment. I didn't know what that would look like, but I trusted that I'd recognize it when it came. In the meantime, I focused on building myself back up. I rejoined my book club. I signed up for a painting class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for. I started saying yes to invitations from friends, rebuilding the social connections I'd let wither. The painting class turned out to be exactly what I needed. There was something therapeutic about putting brush to canvas, about creating something beautiful out of nothing but color and intention. My instructor, a woman in her 70s named Dorothy, had this philosophy that there were no mistakes in art, only opportunities for creativity. I found myself applying that to my life. Maybe all these years, all these perceived failures, weren't mistakes. Maybe they were just opportunities I hadn't recognized yet. Dorothy had this calm, grounding presence that reminded me of the person I used to be before I'd lost myself in trying to be the perfect mother. She'd walk around the class, looking at each person's work, offering gentle suggestions without judgment. She created this space where it was safe to experiment, to fail, to try again. I realized I hadn't had that kind of space in years. Everything in my life had become about managing my son's moods, avoiding conflict, trying to prove I wasn't the failure he'd convinced me I was. I painted a lot of abstract pieces in those first few weeks. Swirls of color, angry reds bleeding into peaceful blues, chaos resolving into order. Dorothy never asked what they meant, but I think she understood. Art was my way of processing emotions I couldn't put into words, of externalizing the turmoil inside me and giving it shape and form outside of my own head. My son noticed the changes in me. He commented on how I seemed distant, how I was never home anymore. He tried the usual manipulation tactics, the wounded looks and heavy sighs, but they didn't land the way they used to. I'd built up an immunity, a resistance to the poison that had been slowly killing me for years. When he asked for money now, I simply said no. No explanation, no justification, just no. It drove him crazy. Thanksgiving was approaching, and traditionally I hosted the family dinner at my house. My sister, her husband, their kids, my brother and his family, sometimes a few cousins and their spouses. It was always a big production, and I usually started planning weeks in advance. But this year, I didn't want to do it. The thought of pretending everything was fine, of watching my son play the devoted child in front of family while treating me like an ATM in private, made me physically ill. I called my sister and asked if she'd host this year. She agreed immediately, understanding in that way only sisters can. But then she said something that planted a seed in my mind. She said that if I wanted to address the situation with the family present, Thanksgiving might be the time to do it. Everyone would be there. There'd be witnesses. He couldn't manipulate the narrative if everyone heard the truth directly from me. The idea terrified me. Public confrontation wasn't my style. I'd spent my whole life avoiding conflict, keeping the peace, making sure everyone else was comfortable, even at the expense of my own well-being. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe I'd been so afraid of making waves that I'd let myself drown. I told my sister I'd think about it, but honestly, I'd already made up my mind. It was time to stop hiding. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were tense. My son seemed to sense that something was coming. He'd escalated his attempts at manipulation, alternating between sweet and vicious, trying to find the right button to push to get me back under his control. But I documented everything. I had my journal filled with dates and quotes and dollar amounts. I had the screenshots from his phone. I had bank statements and credit card bills. I had the truth, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to use it. One evening, he tried a new tactic. He came downstairs with an old photo album, the one from his childhood. He sat next to me on the couch and started flipping through pages, pointing out memories. "Remember this, Mom? Remember when we did that?" His voice was soft, nostalgic, designed to trigger my maternal instincts. He lingered on a photo of us at Disneyland when he was 7, both of us wearing Mickey Mouse ears and laughing at the camera. I remembered that trip. I'd saved for a year to afford it, worked double shifts at the hospital. We'd stayed in the cheapest motel I could find, eaten sandwiches I'd packed from home to save money on meals. But we'd had fun, or at least I thought we had. Now I wondered if even those memories were contaminated, if his laughter in that photo had been genuine or just another performance. He put his hand on mine and said he was sorry for being distant lately, that he knew he'd been difficult. He said he appreciated everything I'd done for him over the years, all my sacrifices. The words were right, the tone was perfect, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. This was just another strategy, another manipulation dressed up as reconciliation. I pulled my hand away gently and told him I was tired, that we'd talk later. The look that flashed across his face before he could mask it told me everything I needed to know. I practiced what I wanted to say, standing in front of my bathroom mirror like I was preparing for a presentation at work. I wrote and rewrote my talking points, wanting to strike the right balance between firm and compassionate, between setting boundaries and maintaining dignity. I wasn't trying to destroy him. I was trying to save myself. But I also knew that the truth, spoken plainly and backed by evidence, would be damaging enough on its own. The night before Thanksgiving, I barely slept. I kept running through scenarios in my head, imagining how he'd react, how the family would respond, whether I'd have the courage to follow through when the moment came. Part of me wanted to back out, to just let sleeping dogs lie and continue on as we'd been. But I knew that wasn't an option anymore. I'd come too far, learned too much, reclaimed too much of myself to go back to being that woman who accepted abuse in the name of love. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and clear. Phoenix doesn't get snow, but there was a crispness in the air that felt appropriate for what was coming. I got dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that made me feel strong and confident. I packed my journal and printouts of the screenshots in my purse. I took a deep breath, looked at myself in the mirror one last time, and headed to my sister's house. The family was already gathering when we arrived. My brother and his wife were in the kitchen helping with food prep. The kids were in the living room, arguing about what to watch on TV. My sister gave me a knowing look when we walked in, a silent question about whether I was ready. I nodded, trying to project confidence I didn't quite feel. Dinner went smoothly at first. Everyone was chatting and laughing, passing dishes and complimenting my sister's cooking. My son was in rare form, charming and attentive, playing the role of devoted grandson and nephew to perfection. I watched him work the room, and for a moment, I felt a pang of doubt. Was I really going to shatter this happy family gathering with my accusations? Was I being selfish, putting my own needs above everyone else's comfort? I watched him help my sister carry dishes to the table, compliment my brother's wife on her hair, engage my teenage nieces in conversation about their college plans. He was so good at this, so practiced at being the person everyone wanted him to be. I wondered how many people around this table had ever seen the other side of him, the calculating manipulator who existed behind closed doors. Probably none. That was the genius of his approach. He saved his cruelty for private moments, for the person least likely to expose him, because doing so would mean admitting she'd been a fool. But then he made a joke at my expense. Something about how I was getting forgetful in my old age, how he had to remind me about everything these days. Everyone laughed, including me. Because that's what you do at family dinners. You laugh at jokes even when they cut. But this time, the laughter stuck in my throat. This time, I felt the weight of every dismissal, every manipulation, every time he'd made me doubt my own reality. I stood up. The conversation died down as everyone looked at me, probably wondering if I was about to give a toast or make an announcement about dessert. My hands were shaking, but I kept them firmly on the table to steady myself. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and I saw the flash of panic in his eyes. He knew. Somehow, he knew what was coming. I started talking. I told them about the list, about the 64 reasons he'd compiled to catalog my failures as a mother. I told them about the money, the manipulation, the isolation. I pulled out my journal and read entries, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. I showed them the screenshots of his text messages, the ones where he bragged about his manipulation tactics, where he laughed about how easy I was to control. The room was silent except for my voice. No one interrupted. No one tried to stop me. I could see the shock registering on faces around the table, the disbelief giving way to understanding, and then to anger. My sister had tears running down her face. My brother looked like he wanted to jump across the table. The kids had stopped eating entirely, staring at their uncle like they were seeing him for the first time. When I finished, I sat down. The silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable. Then my son started talking. He tried damage control, said I was exaggerating, that I was taking things out of context. He said the text messages were just guy talk, that he didn't mean any of it. He tried the wounded son routine, tears welling up in his eyes as he talked about how hard it had been living with me, how controlling I was, how nothing he did was ever good enough. But this time, it didn't work. This time, people didn't rush to comfort him. This time, they turned to me instead. My sister spoke first, asking me why I hadn't told her sooner. My brother asked what he could do to help. My nephew, who'd always looked up to his cousin, looked disgusted. Even my nieces, who usually stayed out of adult drama, seemed shocked by the revelations. My son tried a few more tactics. He got angry, raised his voice, demanded to know how I could humiliate him like this in front of the family. When that didn't work, he tried minimizing, said it wasn't as bad as I was making it sound. When that failed, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door, announcing he was leaving, expecting someone to stop him. No one did. The aftermath of that dinner was messy and complicated. My brother sat down with him the next day and confirmed every detail I'd shared. My sister helped me change the locks on my house. My nephew helped me move his belongings out while he was staying at a friend's place, refusing to answer calls from any of us. The family rallied around me in a way I hadn't experienced in years, and I realized how much I'd isolated myself, how much support I'd pushed away because I was ashamed of what was happening. In the days that followed, family members reached out with their own observations and concerns they'd kept to themselves. My brother told me he'd always felt something was off about the way my son talked to me, but didn't want to overstep. My niece mentioned she'd stopped bringing friends around because my son made inappropriate comments that made everyone uncomfortable. Even my ex-husband called, something that hadn't happened in years, to say he'd noticed concerning patterns when our son visited him, but assumed it was just between father and son, not realizing I was experiencing worse. The revelation that others had seen red flags but stayed silent was both validating and painful. It made me wonder how different things might have been if someone had spoken up sooner, or if I'd been open enough to hear it if they had. But I also understood the complexity of family dynamics, how we all navigate these relationships trying to avoid conflict, hoping problems will resolve themselves. But the real justice came about a week later. He'd been telling people his own version of events, painting himself as the victim of an unstable mother who'd kicked him out without warning. But too many people had been at that Thanksgiving dinner. Too many people had seen the evidence, heard the truth. His reputation, carefully cultivated over years, crumbled in days. Friends stopped returning his calls. Extended family members who'd planned to help him with various things backed out. The girlfriend broke up with him when she realized the gravy train had permanently left the station. He tried to get me to take him back, sent long text messages apologizing and promising to change. But I'd learned enough about manipulation to recognize that these weren't genuine apologies. They were bargaining chips, attempts to regain access to my resources. I didn't respond to the messages. I didn't engage at all. I'd said everything I needed to say at that Thanksgiving dinner, and now it was time to focus on myself. The weeks after Thanksgiving brought an unexpected peace. My house felt different without him in it, lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. I could breathe deeper, sleep better. I stopped looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next manipulation, the next guilt trip, the next financial crisis that only I could solve. I threw myself into painting with a renewed vigor. What had started as therapy became a genuine passion. I painted landscapes of places I'd never been but wanted to visit. I painted portraits of women who looked strong and free. I painted abstract pieces that represented emotions I'd suppressed for years. My instructor Dorothy said I had a natural talent, that I should consider showing my work at the community center's art show. The idea terrified me at first. Putting my art out there felt vulnerable in a way that confronting my son at Thanksgiving hadn't, but I decided to do it anyway. I selected 5 pieces that felt most representative of my journey, gave them titles that meant something to me, and submitted them to the show. When opening night came, I stood in front of my paintings, watching strangers examine my work, and I felt a pride I hadn't experienced in years. My sister came to the show, and my brother and several friends I'd reconnected with over the past months. They stood in front of my painting titled Breaking Free, a piece with chains dissolving into butterflies, and they understood immediately what it represented. One woman I didn't know spent a long time in front of a painting I'd called The Cost of Love, and when she turned around, she had tears in her eyes. She said it spoke to something she'd been going through, that it made her feel less alone. That's when I realized that my pain, my struggle, my journey from victim to survivor could help other people. Not in some grand, sweeping way, but in small, personal moments like this, where someone saw themselves reflected in my art and knew they weren't alone in their experience. It gave everything I'd been through a purpose I hadn't anticipated. I started volunteering at a local senior center, helping facilitate a support group for people dealing with family conflict. I didn't tell my story at first, just listened to others share theirs. But eventually, I opened up about my own experience with my son. The response was overwhelming. So many people had similar stories, children or grandchildren who exploited them financially or emotionally. So many people had been isolated and manipulated and made to feel like they were the problem. One woman in the group, Martha, had been giving her daughter money for years, believing she was helping with medical bills. She found out the daughter had been using the money to fund a gambling addiction. Another man, Robert, had let his son move back home and ended up essentially funding his son's entire lifestyle while being treated like a servant in his own house. Their stories echoed mine in painful ways, and together we started building each other up, learning to set boundaries, to recognize manipulation, to protect ourselves. Martha reminded me of myself in so many ways. She had that same defeated posture I'd had, shoulders permanently hunched as if bracing for the next blow. She spoke in this quiet, apologetic voice, like she was afraid of taking up too much space. When she shared her story for the first time, she cried through the whole thing, kept apologizing for being emotional. I held her hand and told her she had nothing to apologize for, that her emotions were valid and appropriate given what she'd endured. Watching her healing journey over the months that followed was like watching myself transform from the outside. Before I end my story, I want to share something important I learned through all of this. I learned about the warning signs of elder abuse, and I wish I'd known them sooner. If someone you love suddenly becomes more isolated from friends and family, that's a red flag. If they're constantly giving money to someone who never seems to have enough, that's a warning sign. If they're being made to feel guilty for normal boundaries, if they're being gaslit about their own memories and experiences, if they're walking on eggshells in their own home, those are all indicators that abuse might be happening. Financial exploitation is one of the most common forms of elder abuse, but it's also one of the least reported because victims feel ashamed. They think they should have known better, that they're stupid for being taken advantage of by someone they love. But abuse isn't about intelligence. It's about trust being weaponized against you. It's about predators who know exactly which emotional buttons to push to override your logical mind. I recently discovered that 15% of elder abuse cases involve the abuse of power of attorney. That's a staggering number when you think about it. These are legal documents designed to protect vulnerable people, being twisted into tools of exploitation. I never gave my son power of attorney, but I shudder to think what would have happened if I had. The financial damage would have been catastrophic and potentially irreversible. The thing about emotional and financial abuse is that it happens gradually. It's not like physical abuse where you can point to a bruise and say this is wrong. It's a slow erosion of your boundaries, your self-worth, your autonomy. You don't wake up one day and realize you're being abused. You wake up one day and realize you can't remember the last time you felt like yourself, and you can't quite figure out how you got to this point. If you're listening to this and something resonates, if you're seeing yourself in my story, please know that it's not too late to change course. It doesn't matter how much time or money or emotional energy you've invested in a toxic relationship. The sunk cost fallacy applies to relationships just as much as it does to financial decisions. Just because you've put years into something doesn't mean you have to keep pouring yourself into a bottomless pit. Start small. Document what's happening to you. Keep a journal, save texts and emails, track financial transactions. Not because you're planning to use it against anyone, but because having concrete evidence helps you trust your own perception when someone is trying to convince you that your reality isn't real. It's harder to gaslight someone who has receipts. Reach out to someone you trust. I know isolation makes this hard, and that might be part of the manipulation, cutting you off from people who might see what's happening and intervene. But even one person, one friend or family member or therapist or support group can make all the difference. They can be a reality check when you start to doubt yourself. They can remind you of who you were before this started. Set boundaries, even small ones. You don't have to cut someone off completely if you're not ready for that. Start with small boundaries. Say no to one request. Take one evening for yourself. Protect one part of your life from their influence. Each boundary you successfully maintain builds your confidence to set the next one. And please, if you're in immediate danger, whether physical, financial, or emotional, reach out for professional help. There are hotlines, there are legal resources, there are organizations specifically designed to help people in situations like this. You don't have to navigate it alone, and you don't have to have all the answers before you ask for help. I think about my son sometimes, wonder if he's learned anything from all this. Part of me hopes he has, that somewhere in the wreckage of our relationship, he found a reason to look at himself honestly and make changes. But I've learned that I can't control his journey. I can only control mine. And my journey now is about rebuilding, about discovering who I am when I'm not constantly trying to fix or save or prove something to someone else. The painting class led to other creative pursuits. I started writing, nothing fancy, just journaling that sometimes turned into poetry or short essays. I joined a hiking group and discovered that I actually enjoyed physical challenges when they weren't tied to proving my worth to someone. I reconnected with old friends and made new ones, building a social circle based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation or guilt. The hiking group was an unexpected joy. We'd meet early Saturday mornings, a group of mostly women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, and tackle trails in the mountains outside Phoenix. There was something meditative about the rhythm of walking, the sound of boots on dirt, the conversation that flowed easily as we climbed. These women didn't know my history, didn't have preconceptions about who I should be. They just accepted me as I was, welcomed me into their group, and shared their own stories of resilience and reinvention. My relationship with the rest of my family deepened after that Thanksgiving. My sister and I talk almost every day now. My brother checks in regularly, makes sure I'm doing okay, includes me in family events without me having to ask. My nieces and nephews seek me out for advice sometimes, and I'm learning to be honest with them about my own failures and lessons learned rather than trying to project an image of having it all figured out. I even started dating again, which surprised me more than anyone. I'd convinced myself that I was too old, too damaged, too set in my ways for romance. But I met someone at the art show, actually. A man who'd come to support his daughter, who was also showing her work. We started as friends, meeting for coffee to talk about art and life, and it slowly developed into something more. He knows my story, knows about my son, and the abuse and the ongoing healing process. He respects my boundaries and doesn't try to rush me into anything I'm not ready for. His name is David, and he's a retired teacher with kind eyes and a patient demeanor. He makes me laugh, which I'd forgotten was important in a relationship. Our first real date was to a botanical garden, walking among the desert plants and talking about everything and nothing. He told me about losing his wife to cancer 5 years ago, about the loneliness of starting over in your 60s. We bonded over our shared experience of rebuilding lives we thought were settled, of discovering that it's never too late for new beginnings. What I appreciate most about David is that he doesn't try to fix me or rush my healing. He understands that recovery isn't linear, that some days are harder than others. When I have moments of doubt or guilt about my son, he listens without judgment. He doesn't tell me what I should feel or do. He just holds space for whatever I'm experiencing, and that simple act of witness has been more healing than any advice could be. The most surprising thing about recovery has been discovering parts of myself I didn't know existed. I always thought of myself as a mother first, that it was my primary identity and purpose, but I'm learning that I'm also an artist, a friend, a partner, an advocate, a student of life. Being a mother is part of who I am, but it's not all of who I am. That realization was both terrifying and liberating. I wish I could tell you that my relationship with my son has been completely restored, that he apologized sincerely and we're rebuilding trust. But that wouldn't be honest. He's made some attempts at reconciliation, but they've been superficial, more about what he wants than about genuine remorse for what he did. I've learned to be okay with that. I can wish him well and hope for his growth while still maintaining the boundaries I need to protect myself. Some people in my life think I'm being too hard on him, that I should give him another chance. They say he's my son, that family is forever, that I'll regret this when I'm older. But I've learned that family isn't an excuse for abuse, that blood relation doesn't entitle someone to unlimited access to your resources or your psyche. The most loving thing I can do, both for him and for myself, is to maintain boundaries that keep us both safe from falling back into old patterns. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. I know it was long, and parts of it were probably uncomfortable to hear. But I believe there's value in telling these stories, in being honest about the messiness and complexity of family relationships. We spend so much time projecting images of perfect families, perfect lives, that we create shame around the reality that most families are complicated and most lives include chapters we'd rather skip. I'm curious about where you're listening from, what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you listening while cooking dinner, during your commute, lying in bed unable to sleep? Wherever you are, whatever brought you to this story, I want you to know that you're not alone in whatever struggle you're facing. We all carry battles that others can't see, and there's strength in acknowledging them. If my story resonated with you, if something I said struck a chord or gave you a new perspective, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video. It helps other people find these stories, and maybe someone out there needs to hear this message today. And please, leave a comment telling me what you would have done in my place. Would you have confronted your son publicly? Would you have handled it differently? I'm genuinely curious about your perspectives. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more real-life stories about overcoming, about finding strength in unexpected places, about the messy, beautiful process of rebuilding after betrayal. Every story we share is another reminder that we're not alone in our struggles, that recovery is possible, that it's never too late to reclaim your life. Before you go, I want to recommend 2 other videos that might speak to you. The first is about a woman who discovered her husband had a secret family and how she rebuilt her life from the ashes of that revelation. The second is about recognizing the warning signs of financial abuse in family relationships. Both stories offer different perspectives on similar themes of betrayal, recovery, and empowerment. Until the next story, take care of your heart, protect your peace. Remember that you deserve relationships that build you up rather than tear you down. And never be afraid to walk away from situations that require you to shrink yourself to fit. You are worthy of love that doesn't come with conditions or cost you your dignity. I'm still learning that lesson myself, but every day it gets a little easier to believe. Take care wherever you are. And remember, your story isn't over yet. There are still chapters to write, paintings to create, boundaries to set, and joy to discover. The best part of your life might still be ahead of you, waiting for you to be brave enough to reach for it. I know mine is.